We've already allowed a lot of these things to affect us and affect our brains. Literally, people are, we're addicted to our phones. And I think with chatbots, because they're so much more immersive, there's a real risk that we will become even more addicted to these things, be more socially isolated, actually. If you talk about people using AI as kind of companion chatbots, which is already happening, I think there's a real danger there that people will prefer this to the messy human interactions that we have to have. Your spouse or something may challenge you. You may get in an argument with them. Your chatbot probably won't do that. And so it may be a lot more comfortable for people to say, oh, I'm just going to talk to my chatbot. It's a lot easier than talking to my wife or something. I don't know.
So a lot's to unpack in the book. It's very full of like where AI is now, where it's going, your predictions for a lot of things. So I want to unpack a lot of that. But first, I just wanted to get your big take. Where is the AI cycle right at this moment? How long until we actually feel its full transformation in our daily lives for the average person?
Yeah. And this was not one of the questions I prepared for Alyson. So I think, obviously, there's quite a lot of hype around AI at the moment, but it is, very early days. Someone asked me if it was a baseball game, what inning it would be, and I sort of think it's, maybe the bottom of the first or the top of the second. Gartner has this famous hype cycle where you have to kind of go up and there's a peak and then there's this trough of disillusionment and then there's the actual adoption of the technology. I think we're still very much, climbing that peak. So there might be a little bit of a trough of disillusionment coming. But I do think this technology will ultimately be very transformative and will be so if we look back, I think even just in 5 years' time, we'll be quite amazed by the effects that it has had and the impacts it's going to have.
Can you just help us wrap our heads around, why is this such a big deal? We've seen GPT. We know it can make us more efficient, all yada, yada. Why is this such a hype? Why is this the, best thing since electricity in some cases, people are saying?
Yeah. No, I do think it's one of these technologies that has an amazing breadth. It's going to have impacts across industry sectors. I think there's a lot of other technologies where the impact was relatively narrow. It was sort of within one sector or one particular kind of job. And I think the difference with AI is it affects sort of all professions and all industry sectors simultaneously. And I think it has both impacts on us personally and on our professional lives and on the organization of companies and the economy. So the impacts are very broad. And then the other thing is that they're happening very quickly. I think this scale of adoption is much faster than you have with other technologies. ChatGPT, which sort of kicked off most public awareness of sort of what's going on with AI 18 months ago, that hit 100 million users within just, I think it was 2 months. I mean, it was the fastest growing consumer technology to date. So, I mean, I think those two things, the breadth and the speed, are what makes this different.
So with AI comes great opportunity and also great risk. You actually wrote that we face the prospect of potentially not being the preeminent intelligence on the planet for much longer. Is this really a good idea? Have we really thought this all through?
Yeah, no, I mean, this is a technology with tremendous risk, but that is, I think, why people are both fascinated by it and why we need to be so careful with it, because it does have the potential to, for the first time, to have something that challenges what makes us unique as a species, which is really our intelligence. I think most other innovations that have come along have not done that. I talk about it in the book that, when we had the automobile come along or when we had steam power come along, that challenged our physical ability, our brawn. But we never really defined ourselves as a species based on brawn. There were always animals that were stronger than us. We had domesticated oxen years ago for this purpose, or elephants. Horses, but this is different because this challenges the thing that really makes us unique as a species, and really makes us think about, well, what is human intelligence, and how do we measure that? And these are somewhat unresolved issues, but and then if we have a technology that exceeds that ability, what does that really mean? What does it do for our sort of place in the world?
So I guess one question too is, what is the difference between artificial intelligence and human intelligence? How are we separate from what this thing we're building?
Yeah, it's a good question. Human intelligence is not super well defined, even by people who study it, which is not helpful for these issues. But artificial intelligence is basically any system that tries to mimic aspects of human intelligence, so it's always sort of defined against us, and in particular tries to mimic our ability to learn and our ability to reason. So it broadly defines all those technologies that people have tried to mimic aspects of human thinking. I think as these systems have been developed, the AI systems we have out now, what's very interesting about them is they're very not human-like in some ways. They've been trained on all this human-generated data, but then they behave, and in some ways they behave in ways that seem to mimic us, but in other ways they can do things that we can't. I mean, even the ability to recall, vast amounts of information across huge ranges of subjects, most people can't actually do that. And these systems, can, with some reliability, but not 100% reliability, answer these questions across, you can ask it 1 minute a really hard math question, you can ask it to tell you a joke, you can ask it to compose, summarize your meeting in a haiku in French, and it'll do all that. And most people can't do that. And so I think that's why it's very different than us. And I think we're going to have to get used to sort of where it excels and where it has weaknesses.
So I'm curious, we can use it for a lot of things to make us more efficient. What is the risk to our own cognition, to our own brains? Could it be rewired by AI if we will make us super lazy? Like, what is this going to do to our brains that are already tripping out from the social media and phone era?
Yeah, no, I think that's really an urgent. This is weird because we're sort of like in the round here, so I feel like I have to keep looking over my shoulder. No, I think that's one of the really urgent issues that I try to address in the book and one of the dangers that does not get enough attention that this technology poses, is that if we rely on it too much, I do think it will have all these detrimental impacts on our own human intelligence and our own human cognition. There'll be a tendency to defer to the judgment of AI, and we will lose, I think, the abilities to sort of think critically. I think there's a really dangerous sort of framing that happens with the use of particularly generative AI now, which is the idea that thought and writing are separable. That you can get the thing to compose your thoughts in any format you want. It will draft something for you. You just have to give it some bullet points. And I think that's a sort of dangerous idea. And I think writing and thinking are not separable activities. And I worry that with this technology, more and more people will come to see them as separable activities and will actually lose their writing ability. And I think when you lose your writing ability, you actually lose your thinking ability to some extent. So I think that's another risk that is not really been recognized. Again, memory is already, we have a lot of technologies that pose somewhat of a risk to memory. Everybody now Googles everything. Nobody remembers any facts. Nobody can remember any phone numbers because they're all in our phones. And I think AI just exacerbates or accelerates some of those trends. As you said, like with social media, we've already allowed a lot of these things to affect us and affect our brains. Literally, people are, we're addicted to our phones. And I think with chatbots, because they're so much more immersive, there's a real risk that we will become even more addicted to these things, be more socially isolated, actually. If you talk about people using AI as kind of companion chatbots, which is already happening, I think there's a real danger there that people will prefer this to the messy human interactions that we have to have. Your spouse or something may challenge you. You may get in an argument with them. Your chatbot probably won't do that. And so it may be a lot more comfortable for people to say, oh, I'm just going to talk to my chatbot. It's a lot easier than talking to my wife or something. I don't know.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the deterioration of our physical relationships with each other is probably at serious risk. Like, we can talk about the risks a lot, but clearly we're doing this for a reason, right? People are building something because they're excited about it. And actually, in your writing, I was a little bit surprised. You're pretty optimistic. You acknowledge there are some ways this could definitely go wrong. We need to be careful. But there's an optimism underlying all of this. So what are you most optimistic about that this will do?
Yeah, so I am optimistic, I think. I mean, I wrote the book thinking that there are these dangers, but if we can take some sensible steps to avoid those dangers, I think there are these huge opportunities we can seize. And we really, the subtitle of the book is a survival guide to our superpowered future, and I really do think this will give us superpowers if we take the right steps to kind of design the technology very deliberately, and that we have some sensible regulation around the technology, and we can talk a little bit more about that in a sec. But I mean, some of the things I think where we'll have the most greatest positive impact. One is an area where people were very scared when ChatGPT came out, which is education. A lot of educators, teachers were very freaked out by this technology, that students were just going to use it to cheat, that no one would learn anything anymore. I actually think in the long run, we're going to see this as a great boon to education, that we will all, it can potentially give everyone a personal tutor, which is an incredibly powerful thing. And I think we're not going to get rid of human teachers, but it will allow human teachers to concentrate their efforts and assist students individually. And you can have as kind of the AI tutor as this great teaching assistant, and it can provide feedback to the teacher saying, oh, this particular student is struggling in to learn this concept. So when you have that one-on-one human intervention with them, you should focus on that as a teacher. And it allows you to kind of pinpoint those interactions. It also would allow the student, when they're not in the classroom, to learn a lot more. It'll allow people to become lifelong learners. So I think there's a lot of pluses for education. The other big one is, I think, is in the sciences. We're already seeing this technology have a tremendously positive impact on drug discovery. I think in the future, when coupled with things like wearable devices that can give you a lot more data, there's going to be a lot of kind of improvements in personalized medicine. So really transformative effects there, I think, that are positive. And there's one area where I'm actually in the near term super pessimistic about the technology, which is what it's going to do to democracy, where there are paths you can envision where actually this could be a very democratically enhancing technology. There's been some interesting studies. Cornell University's done a few on chatbots and their persuasive power, and that's sort of a scary thing because in sort of used incorrectly, there's a chance that these AI chatbots could have a tremendous influence over us and what we think, and that's who wields that power and for what purpose, I think are very live questions. But you could also, Cornell had looked at people who believed in conspiracy theories, and they had them interact with a chatbot, and actually not that long in interactions, like about an hour dialogue with a chatbot. It found, and the chatbot was told in its initial prompts that it should try to dissuade these people from these conspiracy theories. And it found that actually it had a noticeable effect. People were less confident in their belief in these conspiracies after just an hour interaction with a chatbot, and that effect lasted. So they went back 4 months later and they interviewed people again, and they had drifted away from their belief in conspiracy theories over that period from this one interaction with the chatbot. And that was more powerful than they had done some human controls with even people who were experts who had been trained to sort of deprogram people who believed in conspiracies. And the chatbot was much more powerful. So again, that's a place where if used correctly, it could actually sort of move us away from the political polarization that we're experiencing at the moment. And I'm kind of hopeful about that. But we have to kind of get there first, and there's all these other sort of negative political effects potentially on democracy, which I do talk about in the book as well. But I think in the long term, I think there's a potential that it could be very democratically enhancing.
So there's risks in how this is built, and in a lot of the previous cases, it feels like tech has just happened to us as opposed to like us really controlling the outcome of what the tech looks like. You have met every major leader on this. You just spent some time with Satya Nadella of Microsoft. You've met with Sam Altman of OpenAI. You've gotten to know some of these leaders, their teams, what they're building. You've been following it from the earliest days. Do you trust them?
No, and none of us should. I mean, and I don't think it's that they're bad people, but they run companies, and companies have profit motives, and I think sometimes those don't align with what we really want as a society. And I think we need some regulation here, and I think there has to be regulatory agencies that have the power to look over the shoulder of tech companies and see what they're building, and and I think we need some safeguards around that. I think we need even some safeguards around what business models we allow these companies to use. I think one of the biggest problems we saw with social media was you had business models built around engagement and advertising, and actually that was a little bit problematic because, as it turned out, the most polarizing extreme content tended to drive engagement more. And I think that's, with sort of AI chatbots and AI personal assistants, there's also going to be this danger that if we have business models built around engagement, again, you could have very addictive companion chatbots, and then what does that do to human connection and social isolation? With influence, again, if you have advertisers that pay the chatbot company to say, whenever someone asks you, I always use the example of shoes, I don't know why, but, what pair of running shoes should I buy? If you have Nike paying the chatbot maker to say, recommend always Nike shoes, that's not a situation you want. And I think you want a government regulator to be able to step in and say, actually, you cannot. That's not a fair response. The chatbots are too persuasive, and I think the FTC could play that role in the U.S. So I think we need sensible regulation, and I don't think we should simply trust that these companies are going to do the right thing out of the kindness of their heart or the goodness of their souls.
And to be fair, some of them have been asking for regulation, and I think they are aware.
They have been, although it's really interesting. They say that, and then if you look at every time so far regulation's been proposed, they line up to oppose the regulation. That's happening in California right now with the Senate Bill 1047. It has happened with the EU AI Act. So it's happening a little bit with what the Copyright Office is doing around AI. So yeah, again, I mean, they talk a good game about please regulate us, and then when something happens, they're like, oh, but not like that. That's not what I meant when I said please regulate us.
Fair enough. So I'm about to open it up to questions. So be thinking of your best AI questions for Jeremy. But one last one before I toss to the audience. You have kids. They are teenagers. How are you preparing them for what they're going to walk into when they graduate college? What is their future looking like? What are their jobs prospects going to look like? How are you preparing your kids?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I wish I was preparing them better. No, I think it's a really good question. It's a really hard question to answer, but I think what we really need is people who are lifelong learners, who are flexible and resilient, because I think no matter what happens, there's going to be a tremendous amount of change and disruption. I think there's going to be plenty of jobs. One of the things I say in the book is the idea of mass unemployment, I think, is a complete red herring. There's not going to be mass unemployment. And in fact, I think there'll be plenty of jobs to go around, and I think there'll be interesting jobs, again, if we design this technology sort of deliberately and carefully. But those jobs are going to change from what they are today, and they may change quite a bit over the course of your career. So I think you have to really have students who and employees who are flexible, who can change, who do not assume their job is going to change over the course of even a few years. I think you need people who are willing to experiment, who are curious, all of these sort of qualities. And yes, I do think, as right now, the main interaction with these chatbots is around prompting. And that's a writing skill, actually. So being able to express yourself clearly in text actually matters. So I'd say that's something you want your kids still to be able to write. Even though these things, like I say, there's this tendency to think, oh, they're going to take over all the writing. Nobody's going to have to write. But actually, how you interact with them and what you tell them to do, and communicating to the AI system clearly what you want it to do, and coming up with sort of clever ways of asking it to do things is actually really important to the outcomes. So I think those things will matter. Like I said, I think AI will be a huge boon to science. So there's still plenty of jobs for people in the STEM professions and science. And when it comes to actually delivering healthcare, I think that still matters. So we're still going to need doctors and nurses, and our pets will still need care. So there's lots of things for people to do. I just think we want people who are going to be lifelong learners and who are going to be very resilient.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, I want to open it up. Has anyone have a burning question? Just raise your hand. In the back. Paolo. Yeah, and I can repeat it in the mic.
We're going to get some mics.
So the question, let's just repeat it, is about copyright. These LLMs, these large language models, have been trained. They feed on all this data and information that the internet has provided. However, they don't always ask for permission. And I've actually heard this era likened to the Napster era, where it's like scrape, 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 don't compensate. So will we ever get compensated for the things we create?
Going forward, yes. And one of the arguments I make in the book is that the era of kind of scraping is over. And it's over not necessarily because the courts are going to say it's over, but it's ending anyway for a variety of sort of technical reasons, and also some consumer pressure, actually. I mean, there's been a big backlash. I think the Scarlett Johansson incident with OpenAI GPT-4o model recently, where they may not have, but the appearance that they may have copied her voice without her permission was sort of shocking to people. And I think there's been such a big backlash over this that a lot of companies just don't want to go near that prospect, and they actually want to know that their systems that they're using have been trained with consent, kind of at the heart of that process. So that's one thing, but more technically, then a lot of artists have started to mask their work online with software programs that are also kind of a type of machine learning that throw off these models. So when the models ingest that material, they cannot properly re-identify it, so you can't prompt with that artist's name and actually get something that looks like that artist's work. But in some cases, they actually poison the entire model, so the whole model stops working. So that has, I think, led people to tech companies to start thinking about the fact that they're going to have to pay people to license this data. We're also running out of public data to scrape. That's the other thing that's happened. And there's huge private data sets There's much more private data than there is public data in the world. But to get that private data, you have to pay for it. So I think the tech companies are learning that they're going to have to license this material going forward. The second part of your question is more interesting about what about everything that's been scraped already? Are people going to be compensated for that? I'm less confident of the answer there. I think we're moving to an era of licensing for any data going forward. I think the data that's already been scraped, it's going to depend on these court cases. And I think it's very hard to figure out exactly how they're going to be decided. I talked to a lot of legal experts around this, and there's quite a division of opinion, but I'd say the slight weighting of opinion is towards the idea that the courts may very well say that simply training a model on scraped data is a kind of fair use. That it is okay to create a copy of all of this data off the internet to train the model, as long as but the key is that the outputs can't be sort of plagiaristic. You cannot have infringing outputs. So I think the courts may say that the ingestion of the data for training is fair use, but you still can't have an output that exactly copies or is substantially similar to a piece of copyrighted material. And you'll still have issues where you can sue over that. So I think it's going to be interesting how that plays out.
Definitely, and one we will be watching closely for Fortune as well. Any final questions? Okay, one here.
Yeah, how does this affect journalists and journalism worldwide? It's connected to data, but also to the public information and finding facts. Will they be behind paywalls more and more? And AI how is it a tool for journalists? I feel there's plenty of journalists in this room. So that's one. And the other one is, what's your take on the Chinese room theorem?
Yeah, those are very different questions. But the Chinese room one, I'll take that first quickly, and then do the journalism one. Yeah, so there's this famous thought experiment called Searle's Chinese room, and it's the idea of like if you had a person in a room and they just had a Chinese dictionary and they didn't actually speak Chinese, and you'd hand them a note through a slot in the door, which would have something written on, and they had to look it up in the dictionary and then provide the translation in a language they didn't speak and put it back out. Would you know whether the person actually understood the language? Would it be okay to say that they understood the language because they could do this translation? And is that any different than what these large language models are doing when they're just predicting the next word with no real understanding of what they're saying? I think it is actually different. I think what we're finding out, and we don't really understand very much about how these large language models work, but from what little we do understand so far, I think we're starting to get the sense that it's a little bit beyond just Searle's Chinese room, that they actually do form kind of conceptual patterns. They don't have anything like a human level understanding, at least at the moment, of anything they're doing, but they seem to group concepts together in interesting ways. So within those artificial neural networks, which somewhat resemble human concepts. So I think there's something going on here that is beyond simply, some people could say stochastic parrots. I mean, I think these are not simply stochastic parrots or Searle's Chinese room. There's something slightly beyond that going on, but it's not human level understanding. And their concepts are not exactly aligned with human concepts. And I think we're going to need a lot more research on exactly what's happening inside these networks to sort of untangle that. The journalism question. Yeah, there's huge potential impact on journalism. I think going forward, it's huge potential to use this as a tool. But as you said, yeah, all this information is being scraped and put into these systems, and ultimately maybe depriving publications of the flow of traffic on which they depend. I think that is a huge risk to journalism going forward. And that, yes, more and more publications will put their stuff behind paywalls. And I think we'll try to build kind of direct relationships with readers. I think they will also increasingly license content to the chatbot providers to make sure that they're being compensated for any responses that a chatbot gives that are based on content from their publication and based on their reporting, that will become a revenue stream for publications. But I do worry about what that does to business models of publications that are very dependent on search traffic and advertising revenue based on search traffic. I think this does challenge those business models, and that's going to be an issue going forward for all of us. But then there's also the use of these to produce journalism. I think it can do things like write headlines. There's already some AI systems that are pretty good at writing kind of basic news stories, but they always have to be fact-checked, and there is this issue around hallucination at the moment. I think these tools will get better and better at doing some aspects of journalism, composing headlines, composing basic news stories. They will not come up with the best sources to interview, or they're not going to go out and do investigative work. They're not going to do the really great enterprise stories that human journalists do. So again, I think there's at the sort of higher value added end of the spectrum, there's plenty of room still for human journalists, and these are just going to kind of be tools that we use in our day-to-day work, and not something that replaces the need for human reporters.
So one last question over here in the front.
How is it that we can not allow the devices to be smarter than we are and have their own agenda?
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of the existential risk question that comes up around AI, and I do address that in one of the book's last chapters. And first of all, I think we can all be somewhat assured that that's these scenarios where we have kind of what's called artificial superintelligence, which is something that would be sort of smarter than all of humanity combined. That's a ways off. I think it's not coming anytime particularly soon. And the idea of artificial general intelligence, which is this other term, AGI, which people talk about, which would be an AI system that's as smart as a human, but not necessarily all of us combined. Those systems may be somewhat closer. I mean, perhaps we'll get there in the next decade. But I'm optimistic that we can come up with ways to sort of control some of these systems. But it's why I think we need regulation, and we need kind of regulators looking over the shoulder of these companies and policing what they're doing. I think we still need quite a lot of research on the superintelligence question, like how would we control something that was actually smarter than all of humanity combined? That's a hard thing to think about controlling. And I think we should not have a system built until we've kind of figured out an answer to that question. And the only way to kind of prevent a system like that from being built is to have somebody say, looking at what's being done and to put some limits on what can be built. And I think it would be sensible to do that. I don't think the risk is huge, but I feel like it's not non-existent either. And therefore, it would be prudent of us to take some steps and invest some money and some time and have some smart people thinking about how we could potentially do this and how we could sort of take that risk off the table. But I don't want that to crowd out dealing with a lot of the near-term risks that are here today.
Thank you, Jeremy, so much for sharing your insights. You can meet the great Jeremy at his book signing just around the corner of the bleachers. But thank you so much for giving us this work.
Thank you, Alyson. And thank you all for coming.